It might just be the greatest racing game in history, yet it will never touch the trophy. That was the scathing remark that erupted across social media the moment critics realized Mario Kart World, Nintendo's newest title for the freshly launched Switch 2 in the year 2025, had no real shot at winning Game of the Year. Shocking? Absolutely, especially given that this high-octane sequel was positioned to dominate headlines worldwide. But now, a mere week after it hit store shelves, the results are in, and it appears that Nintendo's flagship racing series continues to face an unexpected obstacle in the quest for awards recognition. So, what on earth is going on here? And how has this one-of-a-kind franchise managed to remain trapped in a cycle of near-universal acclaim, but zero mainstream acceptance at award ceremonies? Today we are going to rip the lid off this debate and examine why racing games, even when masterfully created, seem doomed to remain the genre that can't. We are also going to explore how this surprising turn of events is drawing attention to a larger conversation about genre prejudice, critical gatekeepers, and whether or not awards bodies actually reflect the gaming public's tastes. In this deep dive, we will unearth the specifics of Mario Kart World's journey, discuss the success and pitfalls of an open-world approach in a beloved racing series, and reflect on how previous games, like Mario Kart 8 and Forza Horizon 5, fell victim to a similar fate. Stick around, because by the end of this, you will have a crystal-clear picture of why even the best racing experiences are overshadowed on the big night. Racing games are too niche. That single statement has haunted the collective psyche of developers who pour their hearts into perfecting these adrenaline-pumping titles. Mario Kart. World's own predicament could not illustrate it more vividly. The title has been praised by fans for its gorgeous visuals, charming tracks, and an audacious leap into a partly open-world design. Critics, too, have applauded it for the sheer scope of content, praising the variety in level design, the streamlined multiplayer, and a creative new approach that shifts the track-based racing formula onto a sprawling landmass full of interactive possibilities. But even if Mario Kart World had achieved an impeccable overall rating that demolished its competition, industry watchers suspect it still would have failed to land a single nomination for Game of the Year at the Game Awards. The question hovering ominously in the air is, why? Part of the problem is that the Game Awards, which began in 2014, have a history of favoring action adventures or role-playing games, especially if they possess a narrative-driven slant. There is no shortage of examples. In the same year as the original Mario Kart 8 launched on the Wii U, Dragon Age Inquisition ended up taking home Game of the Year. Meanwhile, Mario Kart 8, widely regarded as one of the most polished racing games the industry has ever produced, did not even secure a nomination in that category. Bayonetta 2 and Dark Souls 2 both received their fair share of praise, but the ultimate nod went to a big, sweeping role-playing experience that critics generally felt was weighty, narrative-rich, and ambitious. Racing, in contrast, was apparently dismissed as fun without carrying the perceived gravitas that usually captivates awards juries. But let us rewind for a moment. Mario Kart 8's initial release sold incredibly well, despite debuting on the Wii U, a console many considered lackluster in terms of sales. Critics lauded it for perfect track design, a stellar sense of speed, and that all-important factor of approachability. The holy grail of racing perfection, some might say. Yet it was snubbed. Then, years later, Forza Horizon 5 arrived in 2021, delivering an expansive, visually stunning spin on open-world racing in Mexico. It was the darling of reviewers. Its Metacritic rating soared above many of its contemporaries. At a time when game releases felt thin, Forza Horizon 5 had the star power, the sales, and the universal critical acclaim. Surely it would break the chain. Surely it would become the first racing game to snag a serious shot at Game of the Year. And still, it did not get the famous nod. So, when Mario Kart World launched in year 2025, acknowledging its near-zero chance for top honors at the Game Awards became an oddly accepted reality. The craziest part is that fans love to point out how broad and mainstream the Mario Kart audience really is. The Mario Kart 8 Deluxe version on the original Switch soared to absolutely mind-boggling numbers, easily surpassing 60 million units sold. Mario Kart is not a niche brand. Small pockets of extremely passionate sim racing communities might devote their energies to hyper-realistic track racing, but the mere mention of Mario Kart sparks glee among casual and hardcore fans alike. not to mention entire families who enjoy the boisterous action together. So it becomes hard to argue that racing on four wheels is too niche when it is often the very game that unites households across the globe. Behind the scenes, critics point to the intense emphasis on story-based titles and cinematic experiences during awards season as a key culprit in ignoring the brilliance of a finely tuned racer. Big open-world adventures loaded with side quests, emotional arcs, and cinematic cutscenes tend to enthrall juries, who often see these elements as the apex of artistic expression in the medium. Meanwhile, the white-knuckle adrenaline rush of a great racing title simply might not feel deep enough for these voters, at least not in the conventional sense. It all comes down to a question. Does the definition of best game necessarily have to hinge on narrative complexity, or can pure, distilled gameplay mastery also be recognized at that same lofty level? Nintendo's bold pivot in Mario Kart World was an attempt to broaden the formula, presumably to appease that deeper, more open-ended style that has gained so much traction in mainstream gaming. Gone are the days when Mario Kart was just a straightforward sequence of cups and challenges. Now, the team at Nintendo Entertainment Planning and Development decided to craft an explorable environment that links these tracks and challenges more seamlessly than ever before. You can hop into your kart, seamlessly transition through a grassy field, and find yourself within a new realm that begs you to take on specialized tasks, speed-based events, or wacky challenges that revolve around Mario's iconic cast of characters. Critics, though mostly impressed, have pointed out a few hiccups in how that open-world premise is executed, noting that a sense of direction can get lost and that certain missions feel more like standard filler content, forcibly adapted from the track-based structure. But for the most part, it is a thrill ride that extends well beyond the boundaries of a simple race. And yet, even if these open-world shortcomings had been ironed out completely, thereby nudging Mario Kart World to a theoretical perfect score, many observers argue that the game would still be absent from the top category at awards shows. There is historical precedent to confirm that hard truth. You only need to look at Mario Kart 8, some say, and you only need to look at Forza Horizon 5. Both were critical hits that soared in popularity. Both managed to push the boundaries of what racing could be, whether that meant anti-gravity mechanics and unbelievably crisp track design, or a vast open-world festival setting that licensed real-world cars and delivered an unbelievably fun sandbox. Both were systematically locked out of the biggest prize in mainstream awards. Fans repeat the question like a mantra, will it ever change? That question, ironically enough, seems to be answered by Nintendo's other big hitters. Titles like Donkey Kong Bonanza, rumored to be a creative reinvention of the donkey and banana-loving icon, or Metroid Prime 4, Beyond, the next chapter in Nintendo's atmospheric sci-fi saga, stand a far better chance of being taken seriously for top honors. It is not that these games are necessarily more accomplished on a technical level, but they land within genres that critics automatically see as more award-friendly. The same phenomenon played out over the years with The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, which took home the coveted Game of the Year award in 2017. Observers frequently point out that if that game had been a racing title with similarly groundbreaking innovations, the conversation might have ended differently. Industry watchers often mention a form of genre blindness, or perhaps a type of unspoken bias, among the large pool of jury members who decide Game of the Year nominations. Whether it is a conscious or subconscious factor, games that revolve around skill-based driving, the mastery of corners, and breakneck speed just do not flick that narrative switch that these voters want to see. Game of the Year winners often revolve around discoverable lore, the forging of personal attachments to characters, and extensive exploration or puzzle solving. Mario Kart World, grounded as it is in whimsical tracks, frantic item usage, and comedic mayhem at 200 cubic centimeters, is more about delivering pure joy than cinematic drama. But should pure joy be disqualified from serious recognition? Interestingly, many fans argue that the biggest mark of success for a game is not the presence of a trophy, but sales figures and cultural footprint. By that measure, Mario Kart stands among the unstoppable giants of the industry, a crowning achievement for Nintendo in terms of brand loyalty, broad reach, and consistent replay value. However, from a developer's perspective, receiving the highest accolade can open doors to greater resources, creative freedoms, and a sense of validation for the sometimes grueling creative process. Some cynics joke that Nintendo does not particularly need more resources or clout, especially with the unstoppable phenomenon that the Switch brand proved to be. But for the teams who dump sweat, tears, and endless hours into crafting the perfect racing game, the sense of recognition can be a powerful motivator. One must also acknowledge that the interest in awarding a racing game might grow if it had a storyline that rivaled the most elaborate role-playing narratives. But that introduces the question, would that still be a racing game in spirit, or would it become some half-hybrid, confused by too many cinematic cutscenes? Mario Kart, with its anarchy and comedic shell-throwing, is ultimately about playing it your way for the laughter or the skill-based competition. You do not need an extended cutscene to care about collecting coins or nailing a perfect drift on Rainbow Road. Instead, you rely on your own performance and the occasionally hilarious sabotage of your best friend to create memories that last. Could that intangible joy ever be deemed inadequate simply for lacking a dramatic narrative arc? But do not worry, hope does bubble up. Some folks recall that in 2022, a relatively small indie fighting game garnered an unexpected nomination for Best Indie. That signaled, at least to some watchers, a potential shift in the awards landscape, hinting that more gameplay-centric genres may gain a foothold. Of course, that tiny wave was not enough to land bigger commercial driving simulators or kart racers among the top categories. But if smaller recognition can multiply, perhaps a racing game's moment will still come. Confident fans remain optimistic that future installments could defy the stigma, or that an eventual aggregator shift among critics might reward impeccable gameplay over cinematic flair. Now, let us revisit the phenomenon that first triggered this entire state of affairs. Grand Theft Auto 6 was once rumored to be the defining event of 2025, but when Rockstar announced a delay to 2026, the gaming world shifted its laser focus over to the Switch 2 launch. Nintendo, seizing that spotlight, unleashed Mario Kart World to a hailstorm of hype. This was the kart racing juggernaut out to steal the thunder that might otherwise have gone to Rockstar's criminal empire. Cynics said that no matter how dazzling Mario Kart World turned out to be, it would never earn the top spot at the Game Awards. Sure enough, while some reviews were stellar, others pointed out the lack of true novelty in certain corners of the open-world approach. Even so, the general consensus is that it is a critical success. Another exhilarating reason to own Nintendo's new console, perhaps even an essential for collector shelves. But does that matter if December's big ceremony looks the other way? If you are loving this deep dive so far, take a second to show your support with a thumbs up. It is a small gesture, but it helps us continue to bring thoughtful discussions straight to your feed. Nevertheless, it is tough to ignore that beyond the hype and the adoration for Mario Kart stands an undeniable truth. Racing games have seldom, if ever, triumphed in the industry's biggest night. That is what led to widespread cynicism among fans, who no longer expect that joyous gameplay loop of kart-based chaos to be recognized as potentially transformative. Instead, watchers are eyeing Donkey Kong Bonanza and Metroid Prime 4, Beyond, hoping that these more traditional Nintendo sensations will net the top nominations. And ironically, if they do indeed garner the frontrunner status, it will only reinforce the notion that racing titles cannot break into the same field, even when the brand behind them is arguably among the most beloved in all of gaming history. Critics who champion the significance of genre diversity are the ones calling for some introspection. They argue that gaming has reached a level of maturity where we can, and should, celebrate a wider array of experiences. Of course, the Game Awards remains a broad reflection of the press, culminating with a final fan vote. But so many fans are more likely to have spent hundreds of hours in the seat of a racing game that calls their name, rather than meticulously combing through the side quests of an open-world epic. That is not to say that story-rich games do not deserve to be cherished. Indeed, many gamers are enthralled by grand narratives. It is simply that the idea of awarding only certain genres leaves behind entire communities whose experiences are equally valid. The argument that racing is too simplistic or too niche breaks down when the biggest racing game in the world sells tens of millions of copies to an audience that spans grandparents to serious esports competitors. Nintendo's official stance on the awards season is typically modest. They have historically been known to focus on refining their crafts, understanding that fan satisfaction, brand loyalty, and strong sales often outweigh a trophy. Still, There is no denying that audience members value the recognition and the celebratory potential that a Game of the Year award can bring, and not just for the developers, but for the fan community as well. Consider a game like The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. When it claimed the top prize, fans worldwide held a collective sense of pride, a feeling that their cherished franchise had secured a recognized place in the annals of gaming greatness. Mario Kart's legions of devotees do not seem to get that same wave of validation, despite their series arguably being just as iconic and accessible. At the heart of the matter is a bigger question. Who determines the standards for game artistry? Are we strictly tying artistry to narrative and cinematic flair, or is a finely tuned mechanical design also worthy of that revered classification? Many critics who specialize in platformers, strategy games, or the sports simulations argue that these seemingly niche experiences require sublime craftsmanship. Building tight controls, balancing progression, or designing an array of permutations to keep players engaged can be every bit as challenging and creatively fulfilling as penning an emotional storyline. Perhaps then, the path to real diversity and awards recognition lies in reevaluating how we define greatness in this medium. Beyond the Game Awards, smaller ceremonies sometimes do hand out top honors to racing titles. Then again, these smaller shows often lack the mass coverage and cultural impact that the Game Awards has cultivated in the last decade. And let us not forget that the racing stigma extends also to sports, strategy, and fighting games, many of which rarely see a mention in the main category there. Yet, the Mario Kart World scenario is all the more perplexing given that the franchise is not some obscure simulation. Its star-studded cartoon ensemble is recognized and loved worldwide. Imagine for a moment a future scenario where the Game Awards decides to broaden its sense of recognition. A cameo of acceptance for a racing game might evolve into more creative cross-genre pollination, extra consideration granted to how well a game plays, or an appreciation for how large an audience it manages to captivate. In that scenario, the phrase "it will never touch the trophy" would become outdated. Mario Kart World, with its open-world innovation, family-friendly design, and emphasis on pure, unbridled fun, could very well rise to the top if the criteria expanded beyond the boundaries of the typical cinematic benchmarks. But for now, the consensus remains that the best a racing title can hope for is to receive a specialized category award, like Best Sports Racing Game, or maybe a fleeting mention in a family-oriented category. Adding to that irony, Mario Kart World's biggest competitor in the racing space, Forza Horizon 5, once stood as a shining example of how to blend gorgeous visuals with a sense of freedom. If any racing title was going to snag a main category award, that was arguably the one. It roared through deserts, jungles, and scenic mountain roads, earned the highest of praises, and still found itself left off the final ballot for Game of the Year. When that happened, many fans of the racing genre lost confidence that the lineage from Mario Kart 8 to Mario Kart World would yield any different result. And sure enough, it has not. From a purely commercial standpoint, Nintendo stays winning, no matter what any awards ceremony might say. The Switch 2's early success in 2025 has proven that fans are hungry for new adventures in that unstoppable ecosystem. Mario Kart World's worldwide launch was met with lines of excited gamers, plenty of positive streaming impressions, and a tidal wave of social media shares that chronicle everything from comedic item usage to highlight reel drifts. The game's bold, partially sandbox approach to racing will likely keep it in the spotlight for months to come. But the question of Goty status is effectively a closed case before that conversation even fully begins. If you think this entire issue deserves more attention, or you want to stay updated on every twist and turn in the world of gaming, subscribe now and never miss our future deep dives. As it all unfolds, we will be waiting to see if Donkey Kong Bonanza or Metroid Prime 4, Beyond, which are rumored to release next year, can replicate the sparkle of The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild when it triumphed in its launch year. Mario Kart World, by contrast, will remain a shining but unheralded gem, at least in the eyes of some critics who long to see a racing title get the recognition they believe it deserves. Perhaps the tide will change if enough voices within the community rail against the entrenched mindset, and who knows? The gaming landscape evolves swiftly, and tastes often shift to celebrate the new and unexpected. But the broad consensus states that, at present, The unstoppable speed of a racing masterpiece simply cannot outrun the gravitational pull of cinematic or story-driven epics at major awards shows. For those who love Mario Kart, the best reward of all may be the experience itself. The squeals of delight as a well-timed shell changes the race outcome in the final seconds, the continuous possibility for fun at gatherings, and the epic bragging rights after a triumphant finish on a notoriously tricky course. Possibly, that means Mario Kart has already claimed a different kind of victory, unmatched replayability, a guaranteed spot in the Party Game Hall of Fame, and an unbreakable resonance with fans of all ages. Nevertheless, the question stands: will an open-world racing phenomenon like Mario Kart World ever hold the same weight in the eyes of the gatekeepers that have historically crowned the best of the best? Ultimately, this story is about more than a single game. It is about the ongoing struggle for wider recognition across the spectrum of genres, the implicit bias that prizes narrative experiences above all else, and the potential that a tour de force in pure gameplay might be just as revolutionary, or even more so, than the next dramatic epic. Only time will tell whether Mario Kart World will be remembered as the darling that never got a real shot, or if it is the vanguard that cracks the door open for future racing titles. Regardless, fans will keep revving their engines, crossing the starting line, and drifting their way to victory, content in the knowledge that, trophy or not, some of the greatest thrills in gaming might just be found on those winding roads and chaotic circuits.